Welcome to the Developers Who Test podcast, a podcast for developers who embrace test automation so they can ship better quality software faster and have more fun doing it. Today's episode of the Developers Who Test podcast is brought to you by Testery.com. Whether you're a developer who has just a handful of tests or even thousands, then your tests deserve to be running on the fastest and most reliable platform for open source testing. With AI-driven insights and analytics, unparalleled parallelism, and awesome integrations, Testery enables you to get more from your tests. Check us out today at Testery.com. We're speaking today with Scott Moore. Scott Moore is the VP of Engineering at Decision Lens, a company that builds planning software to modernize how the government prioritizes, plans, and funds their projects. Welcome to the Developers Who Test podcast.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thanks for inviting me on and having me here today.
Awesome. Yeah, our pleasure. So you've been in the industry, same as me, over 20 years now, and you've seen a lot of changes. What do you think has changed the most between when you got started with testing and how people are doing testing today?
Oh, man. Besides everything? I started my career late 90s testing on Unis, Solaris, Spark systems as a manual tester. I was out of college with an EE degree. Actually went to the Air Force Academy. The whole pilot thing didn't wind up working out because of an injury. Got medically discharged in 97. And so I got hired into a software job with an EE degree, and I didn't know all that much about software. And they said, hey, we'll start them at testing. Now, the most I got into kind of test automation back then is, part of my job was I had to do testing and go through all these log files and trace messages as they traversed the network through nodes. Got really sick of doing that manually. Started learning Perl to extract patterns and messages from these logs and then assemble them all so I could track a message across multiple nodes really easily. So early on, before I even thought of test automation being a thing, I was already trying to augment my manual QA skills with tools. And I built it out pretty, I only was at that job 2.5 years or so, and I got pretty sophisticated with Perl back then. So, from my perspective, it's changed immensely. Fast forward now, Docker, virtual machines, Selenium, Playwright, all these tools, browser web apps, think of what it was like back in the late 90s. The web was barely a thing back then. So, from my perspective, it's just changed immensely. And I haven't been in, test automation the whole time either. I took kind of a 15-year, I went from manual testing, augmenting my skills with tools, but then for 15 years, I was a software developer, primarily user interface, but also server backend and other miscellaneous stuff. Working from small startups out of people's basement to startups that were VC funded to government contractors to, taking a year break to travel the world to, all kinds of stuff. But I've been at Decision Lens now for almost 13 years, and I really have focused almost exclusively on test automation for the last 8 years. And I've been kind of through 3 iterations there. We used to be a flex-based interface. So our first crack at automation was this tool called Reatest. I wonder if anybody, 2 people in your audience are like, oh, Reatest, I remember that piece of junk. Because it wound up being a year. It's one of those things that gets you off the ground quickly. And then you try to integrate it with your CI. You try to get stable tests written in it. We also had a kind of a bad hire along with that. Somebody who, our first true full automation hire. This was back when I was a UI developer too. I wasn't really full time on it. Anyways, I really don't need to go into that because that wound up being kind of a failed year and a half experiment. Moved on to Selenium based testing with Python. Was on that for a few years. And then we got the opportunity to basically rebuild our product from the ground up in the 2016 to 18 timeframe. And we also did that with automation. We started experimenting with a stack based on Nightwatch, Selenium, Cucumber on top. And, we're still on that. And you guys have talked, you and I have talked about transitioning off eventually. It's still working for us though. So yeah.
Why did you move from Python to Nightwatch? And how did you go about choosing Night Watch?
So the fundamental strategic choice was moving off of Python to JavaScript because I wanted to have more back and forth between the UI developers and the testers. So
Mm.
I didn't want to I didn't want to approach UI devs and say, hey, you could start working on automated testing, but you got to learn Python. I loved Python, by the way. I would have been happy to stay on Python. It's a great language. But I did have JavaScript skills from when I was a UI developer. So the transition to JavaScript wasn't that hard. So that was the fundamental strategic choice. The other interesting thing was when we first started getting into Python and Selenium automation, one of the guys on our team, he put together a demo of using Cucumber. And at the time I was like, I don't know about it. You're going to wind up with this big flat list of lots and lots of steps and everything. Well, over a couple years, we would build basically Python page objects that used Selenium. And I found myself with every call into a page object, I wanted to pass in a string that was describing what it was doing so that string could be logged.
Mm.
And and the string would always have variables plugged into it. And then I realized over time, I was like, oh my God, I'm kind of rebuilding Cucumber, except the string isn't doing the work, right? The English language string is just there for logging. But when I look back and realized, wait a minute, I'm kind of rebuilding and in not as good a fashion, kind of what Cucumber does. And so yeah, when we just decided to do the strategic the change from Python to JavaScript, I definitely embraced Cucumber. And while it is true that we do have a problem, we have so many steps that sometimes it's hard to find the steps. We have over 1,000 steps now in our automation framework. As long as we kind of try to follow some rules and consistently use phrases that allow autocomplete to be used effectively, we can usually find steps. And I have a little script I can fall back to that helps me find steps if I really can't find them with autocomplete.
Yeah, I
So
I
yeah,
love that you bring up that even as a developer, Cucumber is still helpful to you. Uh, the most common objection I get with Cucumber is, I don't want that extra layer of abstraction. But I was a developer using Cucumber, and some of the things I liked about it, I think, are worth that extra layer of abstraction. And it's things like, if you're writing a unit test properly, there's always an arrange, act, assert pattern that you follow. And if you're refactoring your tests like you should be, because you should be refactoring any code that you have to maintain, you start pulling out those arrange, act, and assert steps. And then one day it just kind of clicked for me that, that's kind of like your given when then
absolutely.
statements in Cucumber.
Yeah,
So if you're doing Cucumber, it just kind of forces you to think of your actions in your tests as reusable steps, like while you're doing it, right? Because that's just the way you do
for
it.
sure.
And if you're not doing Cucumber, I can't count the number of code bases we've seen where you come in and then somebody copy and pasted all of the test scenarios without ever going through and refactoring what are the common steps across the different scenarios. And that's when you get a test suite that's difficult and expensive to maintain and flaky tests, because you don't just have one place you need to update whenever the system under test changes. So I think that's one
Yeah.
reason to use Cucumber. Have you seen other reasons that as a developer you might want to use Cucumber?
Well, if you do it right, it's actually a very easy layer to create and maintain. Our Cucumber step implementations are often 2 to 5 lines of code. And when you're dealing with, now we do have complicated steps, we call them meta steps, where we're bundling together a lot of behaviors. So for example, a lot of our steps need to start out by logging in, creating what, in Decision Lens is called a portfolio, and importing either a spreadsheet or pod file. We've wrapped all that up into one step, and that is, one of our most complicated steps. There's a lot under the hood happening there. But
Hmm.
that layer that translates, with the help of regular expressions, we don't use Cucumber expressions yet. We've found that, well, with regular expressions, we can get, all you need to do is know is like eight to 10 things to do in regular expressions, and you can
Hmm.
cover most of your needs. So I haven't felt a strong urge to move to Cucumber expressions yet. But that basically, I found that step implementation layer is pretty easy to create and maintain, as long as you're keeping your implementations fairly short for the most part, with the exception of those meta steps when you want to you find yourself repeating yourself in multiple tests. Like say you start to have 5 tests and they have the same block of 4 lines or 10 or 20 tests, and you have that same block, and you're like, you know what, I want to wrap this up into a higher level thing and bundle that into a step. And that's usually just a little refactoring, like, okay, now I'm going to have a utility function, and these steps are going to call the utility function. So it's all the difficult code to write I think, and maintain is the page object code, because that's where you got your locators. You've got, much more structure and trying to break down a page and say, okay, I've got this component which contains this component, which that's the hard code to write. The step implementation is so easy that even if I was on a project myself, like just me, and I knew it was going to be just me for 2 years, I'd probably still use Cucumber. It actually, one thing it reminds me of, you may have heard this quote, and I think I'll get the gist of it right, but the word's wrong. But Donald Knuth from, one of the early comp sci guys back in the 60s.
The Art of Programming series, right?
I don't remember the series, but I'll say the quote. You'll probably recognize it. Don't write code as if you're telling a computer what to do. Write code as if you're explaining to somebody else what you want the computer to do. And Cucumber is almost the perfect expression of that, because you can execute it like code. I use Cucumber and Gherkin interchangeably, by the way. I mean, I guess Gherkin technically is the syntax, Cucumber is the implementation, but whatever. BDD and Cucumber is basically kind of the perfect expression of what Knuth was going for. Because talk about being able to explain to somebody else. And I often think of it as like, I'm not just explaining to somebody else, I'm explaining to me a year from now. Like when I need to debug this test failure a year from now, and I haven't even thought about this test in a year, I want to be able to quickly get to an understanding of what it's doing. I don't want to be swimming through code, as hard as I try to write maintainable code, Cucumber is just so maintainable from the perspective of quickly understanding what a test does in a test report or in the feature pilot itself. So I'm a big fan of Cucumber. There's other reasons too. I could go on if you want, but we could also move.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing I like about it as well is the portability of the test, right? The features that you need to test in your application often live much longer than the technology you use to implement those features. And we've ported numerous projects from one testing framework to another where the feature files and the scenarios stay the same. And that gives you the perfect checklist of what do I need to migrate from one framework to the next. Similarly, the user interface or APIs that you're testing, they might be moving from, an older version of Java to a newer version of whatever. And you can still run those same tests targeting the new framework. And so that's what I like about it really being from the user perspective. And it's probably also worth pulling up another anti-pattern with Cucumber that folks should watch out for. I think one of the reasons that Cucumber gets a bad rap is, sometimes you go to a set of features and it's like, I navigate to this page and I enter this text for this field, this text for that field, this text for that field. I click this button, and it sounds like what you're describing for what you do is more of this should be like a conversation. So your steps are reading a little more like, when I create this object in our system, instead of describing how specifically they're interacting with the website.
Yes, we have low level steps. I mean, some steps will go to the detail of I click into this input and then I send this text to it. But then we often find, well, sure, we want to have a few low level scenarios that will fail very specifically in a certain spot if something breaks here. But beyond having a few, like say you're looking at a new input form and it's got 2 inputs and a button, you might have 2 or 3 tests that are very specific and working through that, verifying labels, clicking into inputs, sending strings. But maybe you have another 20 tests that need to use that form to get to something later in the test. Then we would wrap it up into a meta step and just have like a single step. Um, so, I mean, a login form is a perfect example. We've got steps that say, I click into the input, blah, I enter the string, I click sign in, whatever. But then we have one step that just says, I log in as, our AFT user. Oh, by the way, I use the term AFT. We call it automated functional testing at Decision Lens. I kind of wish I had called it full stack automated testing, because that's a little clearer to me. And automated functional testing could be interpreted to include unit testing and integration testing and stuff like that. So anyways, I may say the term AFT. I just mean full stack, from the browser down, automated testing. And I don't know how common that is outside of Decision Lens. So,
Cool.
So yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Cucumber. The other thing is it allows you to bring in people who don't necessarily have hardcore development skills. Like over the years, we've had easily 10 to 12 people contribute to automated tests that aren't necessarily JavaScript, savvy, TypeScript savvy people. Because I have one guy I work with, he contributes part-time. He is awesome at Cucumber. Gurkha, he's gotten to know our steps really well. We have steps for Applitools visual testing. He's gotten good at that. We have a framework for doing performance measurement. He's just started to get good at that. He's a powerhouse when it comes to Cucumber. But JavaScript, he doesn't really know JavaScript, and he doesn't need to either to be productive. The other huge benefit of Cucumber is people being able to consume the reports on their own and not need the assistance of an AFT team member to interpret the results. They can get that report and read. Like I often tell people, I was like, anybody who knows how to use the application will generally be able to get, one of our Cucumber reports, read through it, and be able to manually reproduce the issue. And that's hugely powerful.
Yeah, I agree. So you mentioned full stack, and I think that's an interesting area as well. Sometimes when folks are using Cucumber, they're only referring to UI testing, but you can do a lot of different things with Cucumber. Are you testing other layers of the stack as well?
Yeah, so we also have a bunch of API steps. Now, our API steps are not, you had a guest on recently talking about karate, and we've experimented with karate in the past. We do not have steps in our like karate style steps that are saying, I issue this web request, and then you've got a JSON chunk, and I expect this return. That we write. So basically, we work with a JavaScript layer that's generated from Swagger. So we work with JavaScript objects, and we have a custom API layer that we've written. So we have steps that start with API. So it'll be like, when API, I change the name of this thing and the mapping of that thing to be X, right? So you can read it and you can understand, if I'm using the UI to reproduce this, I can read that API step and clearly see the data change I need to make. But the API step runs really fast. And the reason we have all these API test steps is not, we actually don't do a lot of API testing via Cucumber for the sake of API testing. It's more like we want to quickly make data changes. So like if a test is focused on some particular area and it requires importing a spreadsheet, making a few API calls, which usually only take tens of milliseconds. And I'd rather do it quickly instead of using the UI, because if I use the UI, I'm just testing stuff that's already tested by other tests, and it's slow, right? So our initial motivation of API calls was to quickly make data changes to set up things down later in the test. And what I found over the time is, we, as a side effect of our Cucumber-based tests, we're getting a lot of API testing done too. Like the API calls to import spreadsheets and import what we call pod files. It's an application-specific representation of a portfolio. That is probably the most thoroughly tested API in our framework, because we use that for 90% of our tests. They need to set up a portfolio and import something. So so we wind up getting a lot of API testing as a byproduct of our desire to make tests run faster. But we make a point of, we're never shortcutting UI testing. Like we're never going to leave a part of the UI untested. But, it's that principle of, you have a few tests testing the UI, but then if other tests need to do something just to set up data, use API calls, because they're 10, 20, 30 times faster in some cases.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And something that a lot of people don't appreciate is so some people will say, hey, you shouldn't test the UI at all anymore. It's slow, it's unreliable. And now with modern applications, it's good enough to just test the API and then maybe do canary testing or A/B testing on the UI, and then that's good enough. And then there are other teams that they take it the opposite direction and they just only do UI testing because it's easier to get in place, especially if it's a legacy system. And so then they end up with these big test suites that are a little slower and harder to maintain, and maybe can't test all of the different variations because they're going through the UI for everything. So I
We wound
think
up
the
somewhere
approach
in
you're
the middle, I
describing
think.
is
Yeah.
like you're describing the hybrid approach, which I think for most companies is the right way to go because it gives you the best coverage at the lowest cost, so to speak. But how do you go about finding that sweet spot of how much you want to do in the UI versus how much you want to do in the API, and how do you coordinate uh who's writing the tests when you're breaking down a story into different scenarios that need to be tested?
So it's usually all the AFT team, and it's particularly, I mean, we usually have one AFT member per story or bug, and if we have more than one, there's usually clearly like a primary person and a secondary person. And we actually do not have an integration layer. We don't have like an integration suite that's based on a different technology or like karate or anything. So as far as deciding, like the deciding factor of whether to use API steps or create a new API step is usually driven by the needs of the full stack test. If I have a test I need to set up and I know I already have a pod file that gets me 90% of what I want, and I can do like 2 to 5 API calls to adjust the data to test some new variation, that's when I'll reach for API calls, whether it's using an existing one or coding a new one. And so in the getting off the ground with the API call stuff was a little bit difficult. We had to figure out, okay, we got to build JavaScript to build this request. We got to make sure sometimes we get a response and we want to save it because we're going to refer back to it later and everything. But once we built all that and got out over that initial hump, adding new API calls is usually pretty easy. We can kind of like trace in the network tab, well, how does the UI do it? How does the UI do some API call I want to simulate? And then we can follow that. I mean, we don't even necessarily need to like consult the server developers in exactly how it's done because we have the UI there as a guide. I mean, so it's kind of a fuzzy answer. I realize but I guess part of it is driven by we don't have like, we've got our full stack suite over here and we've got our API suite over there. Our API tests are actually a byproduct of our full stack testing, our UI based testing. And the truth of it is, our API, years ago, we were like, our API can be a product, our customers can use the API directly and everything. We've only had a very limited uptake on that approach. So if we had more customers using our API directly, I would take API testing more seriously and do negative tests. Like I know this API call is supposed to disallow this particular request or this combination of requests or whatever. I would take that a lot more seriously if I knew that we had a lot of customers relying on our API sanity. But the reality is, our API consumer is 98% is right now is like our UI is our own API consumer. So yeah, so it's working well to do API testing kind of as a byproduct of our desire to speed up our full stack tests, and that's working well for us right now.
Awesome. So one of the things I picked up on what you just said, you mentioned that AFT team members are writing the tests. So is development and test automation, are those separate roles at your company?
So actually, I'm glad you asked this because this was a strategic decision made years ago. Decision Lens treats test automation development as a development pillar as important as UI development and server development. I feel like a lot of places treat test automation as a sub-function under QA, and QA is often headed up by somebody with a history, not always, but often headed up by somebody whose background is manual testing. At Decision Lens, we actually think of it as you are a test developer, you are a manual tester too, because we still have exploratory testing, but it's almost like the manual test is a sub-function of the people who primarily write code to test. So I'd say our AFT team members probably handle 70 to 75% of the manual testing, but the vast majority of the manual testing is exploring new features and exploring, we call it ET, exploratory testing, is exploring new features. And as we explore, we decide what we want to automate, exploring bug fixes. If it's a complicated bug fix and we know there might be unexpected side effects not caught by regression tests. For most bug fixes, we make sure the regression tests are healthy. We decide whether or not to cover it with AFT or not, and then move on. But we might do a little ET around the fix. If it's a performance fix, we're going to do some manual measurement, although we do also have some automated measurement that helps out there too. So basically, our AFT team is primarily software developers. Secondarily, they do manual tests. Now, on a given day, they might wind up doing manual testing all day because they happen to have a lot of ET to do that day. But
they're not software developers on the main product. They're software developers who are writing tests to test the main product.
We have had people who kind of blur that line though. Like I remember we had a UI developer a long time ago. When we ramped him up on AFT, he loved it. He actually, his biggest problem is he wrote too many tests, and he wound up moving on to another company after a while and left us with like a whole bunch of stuff to maintain. And we're like, okay, we're glad he was really excited about all this, but he did not need to cover every last corner case with these tests because we wound up kind of trimming it over time. But he loved it. And he was like, I'd say he was like 70% UI developer, 30% AFT developer at that point. And we've had people on that spectrum. Some people are only like 5%. Some people are like 70%. So, and that again is enabled a lot by Cucumber, because a UI developer doesn't necessarily need to know how to use Nightwatch to, automate the browser when they have these steps explaining. They just need to know how to use autocomplete to find the steps, and they can write tests for their own stuff. So, but I'd say right now we're in a state where like, AFT team is the primary producer of the AFT code. We also maintain the step implementations and the page objects and framework stuff underneath it. But over time, we've had, various levels, people kind of falling back on the spectrum between just how much they're involved in the AFT coding or not.
Cool. Yeah. What's the typical ratio you try to keep between AFT developers and developers working on the UI and API?
Well, just going by the pure numbers right now, I could count myself as about I have responsibilities outside of test automation, but I probably spend 50, let's say half my time. We have 3 full-time out of a team of 18. So and then the manager in our partner, our development partner, 3-Pillar Global, the manager came up through test automation as well, but he's managing 11 people now, so he has limited time. You could say we've got like
maybe 1 to 5.
Yeah, it was probably more like 1 to 4.
1 to 4.
I'd say like 1 to 4, 1 to 3.5, something like that. Oh, and then the other key part about our manual testing is our product owners and our designers do a lot of manual testing. Because they're verifying to make sure that they usually do mostly happy path testing. I wrote, a story with this acceptance criteria, and I'm just going to do, make sure that from my perspective, it's done. Whereas when we do exploratory testing, we're usually thinking more like, okay, what are some cross intersections with existing functionality that may not have been thought about or specified? Does it behave reasonably over here in this part that wasn't specified clearly in the description? We don't want the product owners to necessarily belabor every possible corner case that a new feature may touch. And that's kind of the point of ET, is to explore all these areas that may not be covered explicitly in the story descriptions. So, but yeah, I'd say roughly manual testing probably breaks down about 75% AFT team members and 25% POs, designers, or sometimes other developers. It's like, hey, we need this thing moved forward. It requires some manual testing. Can you help us out? I know you're not writing code, but yeah, people are willing to wear a different hat for a few hours or a few days.
Yeah, cool. Do you use any kind of test case management to keep track of the manual cases?
Nope.
Nope.
Well, spreadsheets. We
Spreadsheets.
have a very, so there are some corner cases where we're like, look, it's not worth automating this thing. I'd say we have repetitive manual regression tests for maybe 1 to 2% of our functionality, and we just keep that in a Google spreadsheet. So
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd call that
Well, I
really a
mean, I can
tool.
say you can get a lot of mileage out of a spreadsheet, so they're
Yeah,
really good for checklists, and you can tie things together.
for sure. Yep.
Um,
Yep.
yeah. So you're VP of engineering now, and it sounds like you started out as a Well, you started out as manual QA, and then made the transition to developer.
Yep.
But then you made the transition from developer into test automation, and then the transition from uh, into leadership, and then VP of engineering.
Yep.
So, how would you say, you, I think one of the things that I see just as a pattern is a lot of times when they go to get the VP of engineering, they look to the developers. They don't look to people who are on the testing side of things. And like, why would you say that they look to you when it was time to figure out who should be in that role? Like, what were you doing differently than I think some of the other uh, managers who are on the testing side of things are
That's a
doing?
good question. Well, we did we did have a layoff back in 2017. It was a while back. We kind of overexpanded, kind of pushed too hard into a particular market and decided to contract. And it was kind of between me and another guy who was primarily a manual tester as to who they would keep. And we'd already made the strategic decision that testing is primarily a software development exercise and less a manual testing exercise. So I wound up getting kept in that. I did lose a couple of members of my team, unfortunately, from that.
Mm,
Um, so that kind of put me as the, that officially established me as in charge of not just automated testing, but all testing, automated and manual testing. As far as, I mean, why I wound up being VP of engineering, it's kind of my history, my longevity with Decision Lens. The other things I've gotten into over the years, I run a cross-functional team across the entire company focused on performance, doing
mm,
a better job at performance. Um, I the relationship between our major subcontractor, Three Pillar Global, our partner. I'm a key member of that. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily purely my technical background that elevated me to that, but it's also other things I've done over time,
mm.
um, and combined with my longevity with the company. But
Yeah.
what's interesting
Well,
is on the Three Pillar Global side, the manager of that team also came up through test automation as well.
mm,
So I think it really speaks to how on our team we don't really think. I feel like so many teams think of test automation as a secondary, and you've talked about this on other episodes. It's just as
mm,
important to refactor your test code and maintain your test code and care about that test code with the same level of diligence and software principles that you would user interface code, server code, any kind of product code.
mhm.
So I think it kind of speaks to, like, it's no big deal to think like, oh, the manager of the Three Pillar Global team, he came up through test automation. That's not real software development. No, that's not the way we think of things, right?
Mhm.
So test automation is real software development, just like any other software development that we do on the team.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is cool about it is just that, when you're on the test automation side, you get to be very often the ones who are leading the organization in terms of trying new techniques. So, just something I've seen from experience is, uh, during our time spans, Docker was a new thing, right?
Hmm.
And so companies wanted to say, well, should we start using Docker in production or not? Well, we're not ready to gamble production on it, but why don't we try it out for how we do testing, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And so, I've seen that happen time and time again with new technologies. They always want to try it out for these quote unquote internal tools. So like let's say you've got an internal website that's just used by your customers and somebody wants to try Groovy or the Spring Boot framework for the first time. Like they try it out on the internal tool, and for some reason, people think like of test automation tools as being internal tools. And even though they're very important and critical to the success of the organization, they think, okay, the risk is lower if I try it here than it is if I try it in production. And so I was able to learn, the entire AWS stack, like all of the different services they have available, learn about Docker containers, learn about different streaming and messaging technologies, all coming from the test automation side of things. So I think it's probably good for our audience to hear that if you're looking to move up the ranks, sometimes thinking about what you can do that's not just focused solely on the test automation piece to get you that experience. So I like that you brought up leading a cross-functional team in the organization, right?
Right.
It could have been other folks that were doing that, but you chose to do that, and through that initiative, you got additional experience in what the other roles in the company are, additional visibility, and there's no reason that other folks who are in the testing side of things, can't follow that pattern to be more valuable assets to their companies.
For sure. And another thing I've leaned into is the whole CI CD chain. Well, CI mostly. So I've always been tooling around with Hudson, Jenkins, years ago, Bamboo. Like I led the transition from Subversion to Git years ago. The transition from Hudson to Bamboo, the adoption of Jira. Like I was Scrum Master for a while at Decision Lens. So I also have this variety of experience. And by the way, I should mention, when my manager left a couple of years ago, it was kind of like over time we figured, well, me and one of my peers would eventually replace him as CTO. And one of my peers is my boss now. My former peers is my boss now. So it's not like I was kind of plucked as the number one guy who should be, so the head of server and architecture is now our CTO. Anyways, I think what lent me to the VP of engineering role was also the variety of experience I have. I have been doing test automation for a long time, but over the course of my career, I've done a lot of other things, including I was Scrum Master for one team while working on a special project over here. Like I wasn't Scrum Master for a team that I was on. That's kind of a, agile no-no. And I did that for a couple of years and hired my own replacement in that role. So part of it is just a recognition of all the variety of things I've done at Decision Lens since I came here in 2011.
Awesome. So what advice do you have for people with, say, 3 to 5 years of experience where, maybe they're currently working in what was their first job after they got out of school and they've been there 3 or 4 years and they're kind of dabbling with test automation? What career advice would you give those folks for what opportunities they should look for or what things they should learn?
I would say, find that part of your job that you find the most tiresome, repetitive, boring part of your job and try to automate it. Start somewhere. Start on that part that you are irritated most with. And that could be a lot of different things. Like me back in the day, 25 years ago, it was going through log files and saying, God, I wish I just had a way of easily finding stuff. And that's when I discovered regular expressions and Perl and all that stuff. Maybe it's the feedback. Maybe you want to lean into the tool side and learn how to do the continuous integration side. Boy, I wish I knew right away when builds failed, when unit tests failed, and I got a message through Slack or something like that, instead of having to go check a system somewhere or check my email. There's so many different places to start, and think of automation as a very big umbrella, not just test automation, but process automation, any sort of scripting. Over the years, I've just done all these little scripting tools that help me merge branches and run unit tests and make sure everything's good before it gets pushed. All these little utilities. But yeah, my main piece of advice is find that thing that irritates you the most about your job and start trying to figure out a way to get some piece of software, create some piece of software that helps you. And you're going to make mistakes. I've made zillions of mistakes over the years. You're going to mess up. You're going to learn, and other people, eventually you'll build something that other people think is, wow, really cool. He's taken it to the next level. She's taken it to the next level, I should say. They are taking it to the next level. So yes, really start anywhere. If you can find somebody else to partner with at your company too, maybe you need to learn JavaScript or TypeScript or some language, Python. I'm sure most teams I've found are just very helpful with each other. Don't be afraid to admit you don't know how to do something, or you could use a few minutes of advice here that'll save you hours of research and trial and error. So really start anywhere. I think people will generally be impressed.
Well, thank you for being on the podcast. We've been speaking with Scott Moore, who is the VP of Engineering at Decision Lens, which once again is a company that builds planning software to modernize how government prioritizes, plans, and funds their projects. So thank you so much for being a guest, and we appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on, and I look forward to future conversations.